thank you very much, everyone, both the panelists and the attendees in the audience. So this is the first of our series of Bookit Talks. And Bookit is a lab management software. So we work on a daily basis. And myself, I'm the head of Bookit Academia. So I work with a lot of scientists on a daily basis. And we wanted to produce these talks to engage more with scientists, but also to produce some useful and insightful contents. And that's why we have Caroline, Kieran, and Manuel today here with us to talk about the impacts and the changes that COVID-19 had and is having on science. So I'll start by introducing the three panelists, just so you know a bit more about them. So starting with Caroline. Caroline is a professor at the Ohio State University, and she teaches and researches the relationship between science and technology with policy and society. And she was a policy analyst for more than 30 years, and she served both the White House in the US and the European Commission. So as you can see by the papers that she has just shared with us, she's very interested in collaborative efforts to conduct R&D innovation. So thanks, Caroline, for being here. And then I'll move on to Kieran. So Kieran is or was a professor at the Manchester Business School. So he teaches science and technology policy, and he's also a member of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. So he worked quite extensively on policy with policymakers in the UK, in the European Union, but also in other parts of the world. And you can see all his work published on science, technology, and innovation policy. So he has a lot of papers, as well as the political science blog from the Guardian's newspaper, where he was a contributor and co-editor. And last but not least, Manuel, thank you very much for being here as well. So Manuel is very experienced with grant writing and getting funding to R&D projects. So he has helped a lot of companies, but also academic projects getting funding for research and development, mainly from the Horizon 2020. So he's basically here today to provide us with more understanding into how the funding in scientific research works and how COVID might have changed the way science gets funded. So we'll go into more details later on. But that's it for the panelists today. So we have quite of a broad experience here that we'll try to leverage to get the conversation as interesting as possible. So before one of our main conversation topics, and that's where I would like to start, is on the landscape before COVID. So I know that COVID is part of everyone's lives today, but I would just like to go back. It's not a long time, just a year or maybe a bit more than a year, and just try to analyze how everything was before. And maybe we can start with Caroline, and as Caroline is based in the US, but she knows the rest of the world quite well as she worked for the European Commission. And maybe we can just talk about the main differences between the in Europe and in US in terms of funding for scientific research. So what would you say were the main differences before the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks again for asking me to be on the panel and including me. This is a wonderful group to chat with. So thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, before the pandemic, I think we see that there's a great deal of cross-Atlantic collaborations and similarities in style and structure between North America and Europe, where you see a lot of basic research is funded by the government, and a lot of applied research is done in other places like industry or research institutes. The structure is fairly similar between the two, North America and Europe. They've pretty much copied each other over the centuries in developing a similar kind of science system. And one of the features of that system, of course, is open publication or open communication of results. So there's a great deal of commitment to publishing the results of work. So almost everyone publishes some or communicates some part of their work through publication. Now, the publication we know can also be in the form of patenting, that companies, of course, do a great deal of research, and increasingly larger shares of research is done by the private sector. And they sometimes publish, although not as much as the academic and institute sectors, but they also will reveal the work that they're doing through patenting, and then of course improved products, processes, and services that are coming out of industry. So that kind of structure is very similar across the two. And then very recently we've had the rise of China, which is extremely interesting development in science studies, as we see China emerging using a rather different structure than we have experienced in the West. And in terms of the governmental structure is quite different. The internal structure of the way in which they conduct research and so on is different. But they are joining in at the global level with others. And so we see a very interesting set of developments there in the global array of possible research and development activities.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe we can touch on something that you mentioned, which is basically the kind of like the recognition or how people and scientists advance their careers, more on the academic side than in the industry side, of course, but is by publishing papers. And maybe this is a question more for Manuel. And what did people have to do to get funded before COVID? Did they have to think a lot about the impacts of the research in the clinic, or it was just more about who had the most impactful papers or the highest number of papers published?
Well, thank you, Francisco, for the question, for the invitation. As my experience is in my focus of experience, which is basically the Horizon 2020, and now the Horizon Europe, which is the next framework program that will be running until 2027. Let's say that the basic ideas were the same, and the basic criteria were actually the same. When you move towards more basic science or research, it's all about what they call in the Commission the excellent science. So the reputation of the proposers, the main researchers, and all that. And as you move towards a more applied research, which many of it's still actually funded by the Commission, the European Commission, then you start moving more towards the potential impact in society. What we did see after the pandemic, and I will talk about this further on, but is clearly, let's say, a positive discrimination. So new topics were opened beyond what was already planned to focus on the pandemic.
Do you have any examples of those new topics that didn't?
Yeah, we had, let's say, around March, there was actually the European Commission, through Horizon 2020, allocated a very interesting parcel of closer to market research. There was an instrument called the European Innovation Council pilot, accelerator pilot, and a specific call was open in March, just for bringing to market prototypes. So only prototype technologies could apply, that were either for diagnosis of COVID or for improving the treatment of COVID. And this was very specific. There was a dedicated budget and a dedicated evaluator panel. So let's say it was a targeting of the funding specific for this. This was replicated at national level, and not only Portugal, but other countries had, let's say, smaller scale examples of this research focused towards COVID.
Right. So these kind of financial instruments do they always demand that the scientists behind the projects and the innovators think about the impacts that their research is going to have, whether it's short-term or long-term impacts?
In terms of my personal area, and looking already, let's say, to Horizon Europe, which is what's coming now and just opened 2 weeks ago, so it's really fresh. I think you have always some allocated money for more fundamental research, more focused on the science per se. And that would be, let's say, the ERC grants and the Marie Curies and all those classic instruments. But more and more, and this was actually claimed by the European Innovation Council, who is the umbrella organization that takes care of what they call the more disruptive research. There's an instrument that was used to be called the Future and Emerging Technologies. This was the FET. And the FET converted now to something called the Pathfinder. And this is focused on only very, very early scale research. If I think we might all be familiar with the TRL scale, the technology readiness level. And they clearly say that it's for research under 1, 2, and 3, levels 1, 2, and 3. So it's the basic concept and idea, not yet demonstrated at laboratory level or experimental level. And even for these very early stage funding in an open call application, so anyone can apply with all kinds of areas, there is a demand. They call it a gatekeeper. So a condition that if you do not fulfill it, you cannot be funded, which is the technological target. So you might be researching, let's say, a fundamental science question, but you need to at least have a vision of how can this transform itself into a technology or a service. So yeah, there is a clearly more and more a fundamental concern with transforming science into business, which is something they clearly state. And when I say they, it's the European Innovation Council and the Commission, that the United States has done very successfully. And there's an idea to replicate how can fundamental science can go to market.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, talking about the funding, and you mentioned already that the European Commission announced Horizon Europe, which has a massive increase from Horizon 2020 in terms of the budgets that they have available now, which is increasing by more than 35 billion. And maybe this is a question for Kieran now. That's and this is after COVID, of course. So how much do you think that the public opinion affects the funding that is available for scientific research? So basically, my question is that because of the pandemic and because most people thought how important it was to have technology for vaccine production or for diagnostics of COVID, do you think like the more that people become aware of how important the work that scientists do is, the more funding will automatically be assigned to science? Do you think the government follows the public's opinion? Okay, can we see a correlation here?
I think public funding for scientific research is one of the least politicized areas of public spending. It has broad public support from all quarters of the political spectrum. There's a reason why the European Union R&D budgets always go up, which is that it's always proposed to have a massive increase because it's so uncontroversial. And of course, that massive increase usually gets scaled down a bit in the negotiations between the Commission and the member states, because the member states don't want to spend any more than they have to. But it's spending on science is politically uncontroversial, so it tends to get agreed early on in the planning process. I think in terms of public attitudes, how will they change? Well, it's very difficult to really understand public attitudes towards science because science isn't a single thing. So there are plenty of public attitude surveys asking members of the public in many different countries their general attitudes towards science, and those and towards scientists, and those consistently show a very high level of a positive attitude towards science and a high level of trust in scientists, although that varies by where the scientists work. So company scientists are not seen quite as trustworthy as scientists working in the public research base, for instance. So there's very little evidence for any kind of general across the board kind of anti-science attitudes. But what we do see is that people people don't think about science in monolithic terms. People approach issues issue by issue. We all do this with the prism of our own experience, views, identities, ideologies. And that applies to how we think about evidence and expert pronouncements as much as anything else. And unfortunately, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that tendency actually increases the more highly educated you are rather than decreases. So, I mean, those are kind of inbuilt human, human and social frailties, shall we say. That's just the way it is, kind of thing. But I think broadly, people support spending on research. And also, I mean, people see spending on research as an investment in the future. And in a situation where you're thinking about rebuilding and building back better, all that kind of rhetoric, it has a kind of obvious kind of post-crisis appeal.
Yeah. So there's always more available after a crisis has happened than before, or at least they are more willing to do it now.
I think that's right, although that doesn't always last very long.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so this funding will at least for the next 7 years, right? It will last for Europe and the member states. So do you, I don't know, this is an open question for the three of you. Do you think where will these funds land? Do you think it will be very focused on vaccine technology or trying to tackle the next biggest threat, or will they be focused more on other threats or on other diseases that were kind of neglected during this pandemic, so their research also gets a boost like COVID did over the past year? Yeah, Caroline, go ahead.
So one of the things we saw is that almost all the advanced nations, governments put a surge of money into COVID right away, as soon as the pandemic became clear, and a lot of money went into the R&D coffers and went out. As Manuel was mentioning, certain very specific and targeted requests were made of the R&D system. And we tracked that, and we could see, an immediate rise in the number of papers related to COVID. I mean, it was just a phenomenal, spectacular increase in papers of all kinds, including some by me that was out there, talking about, hey, look at this. COVID really increased the activities that were going on. So, and there's a phenomenon, I think, in science funding is that, when money's put out on the table, people will come to the money, and if they're working on something adjacent, then all of a sudden they're that's what they're doing. You may also be aware that the new administration is talking about, in the United States, is talking about putting really tremendous amounts of new money on the table for R&D. And my expectation is that we won't be spending a lot of that money on health, because after the end of the Cold War in the United States, there was a really big shift of funding to health and went into healthcare and health research, medical research. And so I think there's a sense that, well, we've kind of done that, and now it's time to go back to some more fundamental and important topics that are coming up in competition. So the US system tends to work as like a competitive based structure. And so when we get challenged, we react rather than think ahead. That's just the way we do it. And so, when Sputnik happened in 1957, all of a sudden you saw all kinds of new R&D money. And similarly, the Cold War led to a great deal of surge of spending. And then the end of the Cold War, another surge, but more on the medical side of let's be healthier. And now I think we'll see another surge in funding, but I don't think it will be in medical. I think it will be much more towards, computing new materials, some biological sciences, but not necessarily on the medical side. So I think these kinds of changes, we tend to forget the disease activities pretty quickly after they happen. Maybe we don't want to focus on the past and, sickness, but my expectation is that we'll see, at least in the United States and maybe in Canada, we'll see more of a reactive set of funding going in because due to the rise of China to some extent. And also, to some extent, the rise of Europe, which we don't see necessarily as a threat, but certainly we see that the European investment over the last 30 years has had a tremendous return in terms of capacity.
So how do you think, I mean, I can just following up on that, how do you think we could fight that and put more importance on health even after the pandemic is long gone? How do you think health could actually compete with tech in terms of getting funding? And this is an open question again, anyone can just weigh in.
I'd like to hear Kieran on that one.
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to what Caroline said with interest, because in the UK over the last few years, there has been a bit of a kind of a build-up of a backlash against the scale of investment in biomedical research, scale of public investment in biomedical research, both in terms of kind of top-down, so government prioritization, but also in terms of the priorities of individual research performing institutions. So the most research in the UK, like in the US, happens in universities. And much like in the US, UK universities are essentially private institutions or very independent institutions, and make decisions of their own, have a great deal of freedom to do that. A huge amount of investment in the UK in building biomedical research facilities in big programs, and a lot of that has been straightforward copying of what they see happening in the US. And over the last couple of years, perhaps there's been some sense of a bit of a backlash that perhaps that investment hasn't delivered in terms of economic or societal impact. Now, I think the backlash will abate because obviously there are things that the biomedical research lobby, which is very powerful. All science lobbies are powerful, but the lobby that lobbies for investment in biomedical research is very powerful for obvious reasons, because they can enlist patient groups and family supporters and that kind of thing. Those lobbies can now point to the commercialization of mRNA vaccines and things like that, things that have been on the table for a long time, but that have moved forward very, very quickly in the last year or so, and are clearly having kind of substantial societal impacts. So I think the backlash will abate. That doesn't necessarily mean. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with Caroline. It doesn't necessarily mean that the priority will shift back to biomedical funding. There is a cliche about generals fighting the last war, and I think there'll be a bit of that. The UK is desperately trying to build a national vaccines manufacturing facility at the moment, which, to be fair, was already started before the pandemic. But so I would expect to see some prioritization of vaccine research and of manufacturing capacity, because many countries have the UK has next to no manufacturing capacity for vaccines, and supply chain issues have certainly made governments rethink that over the last few months.
Right. And do you think it's also just because biomedical research and anything related to life sciences usually takes longer to see results than any technology development that is not directly related to health? And maybe these, I don't know, Manuel can also comment on this. Do the funding agencies or do the funding bodies usually look at what's the return on investment and how long that return will take? And is that why tech usually gets more attention than health?
Well, I think actually there's been a long debate since 2014 in what is this, let's say, TRL5. So that's my core of experience, which is in drug design or pharma is when we're closing the preclinicals. And so there's already, it's not fundamental. It's already, there's some evidence on the table. And so I've seen until last year, if you look at what's been funded and in this maturity segment, we see a lot of support into drugs that have a very clear regulatory pathway. So things that are, for example, addressing orphan diseases, or many of them that they face regulatory hurdles in Europe, but they are very much easier to be certified under FDA norms. And that's actually something that I think the European funding has been, let's say, pushing forward, is to show the best examples of the FDA in the United States, and pointing at them towards the European Medicament Agency that needs to, learn some things from the USA in that sense. So what we were seeing before was this kind of fast track drugs. They were being approved, or at least they were being funded under the Horizon 2020. And actually now for the next 7 years, again, for this preclinical done phase, what we see is, of a total budget of around 1 billion, the Commission is reserving 25% for health-related solutions. So not only drug, but also medical devices and everything in between. So I think there is a specific orientation of funding to make sure that pharma and health in general is being put forward. And that's called the challenges. They called it the challenges of the accelerator. That fund is actually a blended finance instrument, meaning there is a grant that goes, there is a grant for research that then is followed up by equity that comes from the European Investment Bank, that asks for other funding instruments, private ones especially, to join, to co-fund or to co-invest. Sorry. So in that sense, there's this attempt to bring new life to the VC environment in Europe, focusing more on deep tech and not as much on IT, which I think was the trend with Web Summit and all those nice things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Caroline just asked, what is deep tech?
Yeah, that's a good question that I think Commission has been putting forward different definitions, but I would say if it does not have a patent, it's usually not deep tech. So that would exclude all the software kind of stuff, unless it's hardware for computing. And otherwise it will be things which are much more product oriented or service, but based on hardware, and not as much services like I've developed the Uber off or the Airbnb off, which has been a trend in some segments the last years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And just maybe switching a little bit the gears here, and we have, Caroline mentioned how much COVID had an impact also on the scientific research, that everyone from all of a sudden just focused really on publishing about COVID. But I think it was also fueled a little bit by the willing to help society just get past COVID as fast as possible. But how much of that do you think contributed to the lack of quality in scientific research? And if it contributed to also some misinformation and confusion in the public opinion, but also in the government actions that were taken based on those evidence in the early days. And I'm talking about the papers that were showing people sneezing and how far the sneeze droplets would go, or how long COVID could actually survive on specific surfaces. So all of that, how do you think it impacted how people look at scientific papers? Do they give them as much credibility as they were giving them before, or it's an open question again? Maybe
I can make a start. I'd be very interested to hear what Caroline thinks about the quality issue, the quality of the kind of avalanche of COVID research. I think what I'd say is that quality isn't unidimensional and it's not objective. As we know from the vagaries of the peer review system, experts disagree about the quality of research. With a new problem, you have to start somewhere. And timeliness is also important if research is going to have impact. So, there are clearly, subjectivities, multidimensionalities around quality, but also quality is traded off with other things that might be desirable. But in terms of your question about the public perception of what they've seen of the way science has been conducted over the last year and a bit, I think the public has seen how the sausage is made, to use the cliche. What we've seen is not any different to the way science works in any other case except the pace and the pressure, perhaps. But the things that we've seen, the false starts, the blind alleys, the confusions, the disagreements, the difficulty of integrating perspectives and expertise from different disciplines, all of those things is part and parcel of doing science. It's not easy to make reliable knowledge, and the public has had the opportunities to see both the production of new scientific knowledge and the production of usable technology happen in real time in front of their very eyes. And I think that's probably a good thing. I don't think we should be afraid of it. I think there is a tendency on the part of the scientific community still, and it's changed a lot, but I think there's still a tendency to perhaps want to mystify the processes of doing science, and perhaps to also to take advantage of kind of persistent myths of scientists as kind of morally superior, superhuman, objective, rational individuals who are kind of they're hewing facts out of the bedrock of the universe, kind of thing, whereas actually it's a social, messy process, as it has to be if you're going to, because science is not just about generating knowledge claims, it's about validating knowledge claims, and that's essentially a social process. So I think it's a good thing that people get to see how science is really made. I think it will probably lead to more trust and faith in science rather than less. I think the thing that creates concerns and confusion amongst different publics that are not participants in the scientific enterprise is probably the mismatch between the mythology and the reality. So if we can dispense with the mythology and go for that much richer and glorious but messy reality, then I think it's probably a good thing in terms of public attitudes towards science.
Right. And I think also somewhere in the middle between the scientists and the public lies the media, right? And I think it's probably the media that should actually get along with the scientists first, so they just don't pick whatever paper comes out and just publish saying that scientists claim this and that, and then the public doesn't know what to believe in. And at the end, they start doubting the scientists because they don't understand the process, and they don't understand that science also needs to be validated further, and that a scientific paper is not the absolute truth, so that they should also understand it. And we have Caroline, I think she wants to weigh in as well. Go ahead.
So I couldn't agree more with Kieran's statement. And in fact, it brings to mind for me two trends that I saw over this COVID period. One is a very positive one, and one is more troubling. But I agree 1000% with Kieran. Science is not about truth. It's not about finding the truth, right? And in fact, it's quite uncertain, and all the time testing, whether we understand things correctly or not. And that process that was played out in front of people, I think was probably a positive move, because people began to realize, okay, I understand now that we have to continually question and test. And in that sense, one of the positive trends I see that came out of COVID was much more citizen science. So there were apps developed. I participated in an app after I got my first vaccine, where there was an app that asked, how are you feeling today? Do you have any side effects? And that all went back into a big database. And I felt so good because I was like contributing, you know, and I think a lot of people had that sense, and I think there is more interest in citizen science in bringing more people into the process so that it's not so, you know, mythological as Kieran rightly pointed out. It's not, you know, wizards in a castle. It is really a process, social and scientific process that we can have people involved in. So I think that the whole move towards citizen science and towards localizing science is a really positive thing. And I hope it continues out of the COVID experience. But the second thing that I've seen a little bit that's concerning, and I think this goes across a number of different scientific systems, and that is kind of asking science for specific goods. In which, you know, we got the COVID vaccine, which was an amazing, incredible breakthrough of all scientists working together, and they had been working on it for years ahead. So this is not something that we just pulled out of a hat this last year. People are working on coronavirus for many years, and the mRNA science has been researched for a long time. So out of a hat, and we need to have the commitment to a lot of basic research in order to have any goods emerge. And so, you know, interestingly, and I'd like to see what Manuel thinks about this, because it sounds like in the current EU horizon, there's a lot of like, here's what we're hoping to get out of the system, you know, here are the technologies that we want, when in fact, the system doesn't work like that. We can't ask it. It's not like the Santa Claus of technology. So we can't necessarily ask for things. A lot of times these things emerge from our investments in a whole range of different possible outcomes. And so I'm concerned on the US side and in what I hear from Europe and Asia too, of a sense of like, well, we're going to just order up these kinds of developments. And then we'll perhaps judge the system as to whether or not they're giving us these goods that we want. I think we have to be clear to the public in general and to ourselves that we cannot lay out a set of very specific goods that we want to get and then judge the system as to whether or not they've given us those goods.
Absolutely. Manuel, you wanna?
Yeah, I would add on that. I agree with Caroline. I think what we have seen even in the previous program, so Horizon 2020, is that although there are clear objectives or expectations on certain topics, there is always this idea that we say, but we will leave a lot of topics also as open questions. So let's say if it is something, it's a positive discrimination. So I think there is not a single issue where they say we are only going to finance health and green tech, but they will say, okay, let's reserve half the budget for these things, which I think are Santa Claus lists for sure, but let's hope for the best. And especially for as we go towards more fundamental research, the number of lists increases. So let's say they are less prescriptive or less restrictive than when we go more closer to market, because there is a clear approach when we're talking about prototype level, so TRL 5.6, that the two major aims of the Commission is pharma or health in general, and the circular economy and the Green Deal. So environmental related technologies, let's say. But if we look closer to the Pathfinder, so TRL 1 to 3, so fundamental principles, there are much more interesting questions, open questions from the scientific point of view. One is the search for what they call, let's say, true artificial intelligence. Another is tools to measure and stimulate activity in brain tissue, so completely different. Gene and cell therapies, novel routes to producing green hydrogen, and engineered living materials. These are, let's say, the major focus of fundamental science research. But there is always this other part, which is it's an open question. Anyone can run for it, and if you have a sufficiently high or excellent CV on research, then there is also a bit of the cake for you, let's say.
I think it's worth keeping in mind as well that it's a multi-level system in the EU, and the member states and the participating countries as well are funding research at the national level, and I suppose there's always been a tacit understanding that the member states would be funding, you know, the kind of more fundamental research, and the EU programs have historically been, you know, relatively applied, although that the way that the kind of shape that's taken has varied over the decades. And it's only really with the advent of the ERC and things like Marie Curie that it's become a bit more focused on what we might call basic research. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, and then this is another pre-pandemic thing that might still have resonance post-pandemic, is that the EU R&D thinking has been very heavily influenced by the notion of challenge orientation and mission orientation, as popularized by people like Mariana Mazzucato, trying to learn lessons again often from the US experience, but not only. And so a lot of the language, and I think one of the things about science policy is that the language changes from time to time with fashion, but the underlying content doesn't always change that much. It doesn't change as quickly, partly because, as Manuel says, it's often still very responsive, you know, so it's still dependent on ideas from the scientific community. Those ideas are effectively being selected by members of the scientific community acting as reviewer panels. So, I mean, you know, the language and the rhetoric of the kind of high-level priorities does change over time, and you get new instruments and new mechanisms, but there's a lot of continuity as well, I think.
Right.
I would just add on top of Kieran, because I think you mentioned a very specific point, which is the nomenclature that now Horizon Europe is using is clearly transcribed from other experiences in the United States. And actually the concept of mission is the first time it's employed, and it's now on Horizon 2020. So at European level, of course. And it's clear that there is a focus on these challenge-oriented funding, let's say.
Right. Yeah, I think the take-home message is that there should be a lot of funding for basic research for sure, because we never know when we're going to need it, and we needed it for COVID, for mRNA technologies and vaccine production, and we might need it in the future for other threats as well.
I think it's generally a false opposition. So to a large extent, we create a false opposition when we talk about basic versus applied, as if it's a zero-sum game. But in practice, you know, those are subjective. There's nothing different about. There's nothing fundamental about fundamental science. You know, you can make fundamental discoveries from trying to solve very practical problems, and vice versa. So. You know, as I say, regardless of the label, often the same science gets done. I'm less worried about that. I think the basic science. I think the point where I agree with Caroline is that because we can't predict and we can't dictate technological trajectories in advance in detail, it doesn't matter that much how precise our priorities are, and we can offer a lot of freedom, and the freedom is important as part of the social incentive to attract scientists and engineers to do research. So, and the other important thing is that kind of the more, for want of a better word, the more basic research end of the system, which is usually in the public research base, is where new scientists and new engineers, new researchers come from. It's the place that the human capital, if you like, for research is produced. Most researchers work in industry in developed countries. The vast majority of researchers work in industry, but they're all produced in the public research base. They're all trained in the public research base. So it's essential for that, and the priorities, the agendas matter less than the kind of quality of that training, I think.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, and switching gears again completely. We have been almost for 50 minutes already, but I have to ask this question, and it's about patents, and should the patents be open or not, and how much of the problems that we're currently seeing on solving this pandemic are political versus scientific or technical. I would just like to hear your opinions on it. Anyone want to go first?
I'll jump in. Actually, now you're going to push a button and I start talking about how the trouble with patents. So patenting, started out with the idea of encouraging risk takers to share what they have invented. That was the original idea of a patent, is to encourage them to write it down and let other people see it, because that would spur other innovation. And it was actually, I think it's the US Constitution is the first constitution to ever even mention patenting as a right. So it's written right into our Constitution that patenting is a good thing, and that we want to encourage people to claim some rights over their knowledge. Over time, the patenting system has gotten quite distorted, and we know that there are patent thickets and there are patent blocks, and there's a lot of funds that get exchanged without wealth being created, attached to patent cases being brought against one company or another, which really bogs down the innovation system, in my personal opinion. I think it would be upheld by the research out there. So then the question comes up, who owns the patent for the vaccine, and whether or not it's right that a single company should hold that vaccine patent. Now, here we get back to, I think, to Manuel's original point, right? And that is that, these funds have been put in and with the idea of helping a large number of people. And it's hard to track that funding just to one specific system. We can't say that the funding came from the United States. When you look at the actual activities that have been going on in mRNA and coronavirus research, they have been highly international and highly cross-border collaborations. And so the idea that any one nation or one company would hold onto that patent seems to question the propriety of the patent system as it's related to ensuring public good. So I would say that, in my personal opinion, I would like to see mandatory licensing for those patents, so that any company that's able to make them, and I believe this is actually allowed under the TRIPS agreement and WTO, that if you're going to use it in your own nation, that you should be able to produce it for your own internal use. I don't think that's against TRIPS, and I think that would be a much better outcome for this. I think this is a technology that belongs to the human race and not to any company, although that's my little soapbox lecture for the day. I'll pass.
I agree completely with Caroline. I think most nations have provisions in their intellectual property laws for intellectual property rights to be suspended in certain circumstances. I think Caroline's right. As I understand it, I'm not an IP expert, but as I understand it, that doesn't contravene any international agreements. Nobody wants to be the first to do that, of course, because there's a lot of informal sanctions that could be applied by retaliations that could be applied by countries or companies. Caroline's absolutely right. One of the interesting things about science policy is that science is a globalized enterprise, although it's a globalized enterprise in which some countries are more present than others, of course, but it's a globalized enterprise. But science policy is a nationalized kind of policy area, and a kind of nationalized rhetoric as well, nationalist rhetoric often. So so I think there is a mismatch there. It's meaningless for countries to claim that vaccines are theirs in any way. It's also meaningless for these companies. In most cases, these the early vaccines are mainly being produced by companies that don't normally produce vaccines. That have essentially just done a deal with a small biotech or a public research organization that's developed the technology. So, you know, the kind of those traditional considerations around patenting, the incentive tradition considerations that Caroline mentioned, do they really apply in that kind of innovation model? And the global public emergency and the fact that none of us are safe from COVID until everybody is safe from COVID. You know, it's a no-brainer that the technologies should be available everywhere. And how that's done is a matter, you know, that's up to the companies and the governments, but if necessary, suspending or enforcing pooled patents or compulsory licensing, you know, yeah, of course, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't live isolated in such an international and globe where everyone just travels everywhere and everyone needs everyone else in other countries. So I totally agree. I don't know if Manuel, if you have anything to add on that.
Not in this particular point. I think
Okay.
Caroline's and Kieran's opinions are.
Yeah, I think that was a good answer. So thank you both. Yeah, so we're near the end. I think we have a question from Owen. Maybe Manuel and the others can also weigh in, and he's asking, do you think Brexit will have negative effects on UK researchers getting access to Horizon Europe funding, even despite officially staying part of it?
Well, I can start because I've had hands-on experience just the last 2 weeks. I'm coordinating 2 consortiums of that one Horizon 2020 projects and have the UK participants, namely the University of Birmingham. And I think for those institutions that are already used to this kind of instruments, I think after the UK government confirmed that this was the let's say a similar status to associated member was being kept, then this did not affect participation because the consortiums are established, researchers know each other, and you know, good collaboration continues as is. For new organizations trying to join the game, let's call it, I think at the beginning it might be the Brexit feeling might be a bit disconcerting to find that it could be an obstacle. But I don't know, Kieran, what's your experience on this?
Yeah, I agree with Manuel. I think, I mean, there was some, we don't have a great deal of hard evidence on this, but there's some evidence that UK groups less likely to be coordinators in Horizon 2020 projects and in the period surrounding Brexit. So I think Manuel is right. You know, with existing partnerships, existing networks, partners in the member states will be relieved that they can still involve the UK collaborators. On the other hand, when new partnerships are being formed, we know that, you know, lots of myths traditionally persist, perhaps in the less informed parts of the European research system about, the rules of the game, and you have to have a Southern European collaborator, you have to have an Eastern European collaborator, all of those kinds of myths. Maybe, I certainly, it appears that those kinds of myths were prevalent over the last few years, that that you will be looked unfavorably on if you have a UK coordinator. So I think there is some space for some disruption caused by kind of miscommunication and misunderstandings. But I imagine, as Manuel says, it will settle down because it's in everybody's interests for the collaboration to continue.
I would dare to say that on the years leading up to Brexit, this was actually let's say a leverage point for the European Union to try and pressure some organizations that if Brexit would come to happen and how Brexit would come to happen, that this would be a big problem for let's say a sector of the UK research organizations. So in that sense, myths like the ones Kieran was mentioning, like having a UK coordinator would be prejudicial were in fact widely circulated. But I think now that the issue is done as it is, that it's no longer a question.
Caroline?
People forget that the UK has always been ambivalent about the European experience. So, I mean, in the earliest days, when the initial projects were getting going, Bright and Eureka and so on, UK stayed out of the original activities and only came in later. And then in the time when I was working with the European Commission, doing some evaluation with them, almost everyone I met was from the UK. So, but one of the things that I think I would totally agree with Kieran and Manuel, and that is, scientific collaboration tends to self-organize around reputation of the people involved. And so even when we looked at COVID research, for example, what happened in the aftermath of the shock of the pandemic is that almost right away, US, UK, and Chinese collaborators began working together very rapidly and without any direction from any specific government. These kinds of connections organized within the science system, independent of kind of top-down direction. So I would say that we would expect that while there will be some influence on the relationship, the UK has tremendous deep strength in many areas of science, and that will be an attractive feature for collaborative work, no matter whether their particular participation in any individual project in the Horizon program.
Right. Yeah, I think the scientific community and both Europeans and UK researchers will have a lot to benefit from maintaining those relationships and partnerships and collaborations going for many years. So I don't know if anyone else has more questions, but we've been, I feel like we could stay here talking for hours and hours. So just to finalize it, I would just like to ask you a question to the three of you, and please just be brief about it. I just want to hear about your personal take on it. And what is in your opinion the next biggest threat that we'll face as humanity? Anyone can go first.
I'm not sure I'm qualified to speculate. I mean, I think so. This is a very interesting thing. The pandemic, a global pandemic caused by a virus jumping the species barrier, was at the top of every country's risk register. It's been identified as a kind of wildcard risk by every foresight exercise over the last 30 years. You can't say we didn't know it was coming. And it's one thing to know something is coming. It's another thing to make deep preparation for it. I think there will be, evidently in research policy over the next few years, there will be a very self-conscious focus towards future-oriented risk thinking, whatever that is, the artificial intelligence taking over the world or whatever. So for the next few years, expect a lot of that discourse, and it might displace the challenge and mission orientation discourse to some extent. Whether it will have any real impact in terms of our preparedness for whatever the next risk is a slightly different question.
Right. Caroline?
This is a great question, Kieran, as whether risk overtakes or kicks out mission orientation. That's a great question. That would be worth an article right there. And I agree that we are considering risk. One of the things COVID showed us, I completely agree with Kieran, that, like, the system has tried to anticipate this pandemic for a long time, but it's one of those high consequence low probability events that it's hard to, I don't know about you, but it's hard to pay insurance on my house burning to the ground, right? Because the likelihood is really, really low, but I still pay the insurance, but each year I want to pay just a little bit, I don't want to pay for the whole thing, but if my house burns down, I surely want the money. So I think that we always have to balance those kinds of considerations at the national level, in terms of science policy. One of the things that I think we know is we know that the great risk is right there, and that is in climate. We know that climate change is tremendously risky for all of us, and the risk devolves right down to the individual level. It's not as if we would say it's just a national risk or global risk. We have issues right in our own backyards around, where insects and, what's the soil capabilities to grow food. And so, this is where I see a hope for citizen science and to involve a lot more people in the process of helping science move forward. I think that what we've seen with COVID is when we all put our minds to something, we can be utterly brilliant. And that combined efforts are really a wonderful thing. That we all came together to help each other around this pandemic has been, I think, will be a shining silver lining out of the experience. So I'm hopeful that we can take that kind of cooperative sense of success forward, in addition to risk, of course, as Karen said, but that we learn from the cooperative nature of our response and could take that forward to the next risks, which are really right on the doorstep at this point.
Absolutely.
I will follow up on what Caroline is mentioning, which is climate change for sure is the greatest threat to mankind, and adding to that would be the way we relate to artificial intelligence. We are and the big data and the way data is processed that can cause suddenly very powerful transformations in society that are not necessarily beneficial or evil. They can just be, completely transforming. It's like when you started having combustion engines and all horses went first they were unemployed and then they were eaten and died, right? But so in that sense, there are a lot of fundamental things in our society that they can just be made redundant. And how we deal with this redundancy, is it for people to have the right to work less and to be more creative or take care of their elderly? There are innumerous solutions that are as political as they are social. So I think that will be the thing. Is it will be fast changing, which is the new item here on the table, is that we are not having time to think about change because change happens at a rate that, let's say, we are not as much ready to handle.
Maybe I can be mischievous as well and add to this the threat to the scientific community from automation. So we keep hearing that AI is going to make scientists redundant, and I think there's lots of reasons to be skeptical of that, but perhaps that's a risk that that we ought to be discussing as well.
Yeah, I think that would give us a topic for another talk for sure. But yeah, thank you very much for the three of you for your incredible insight into the conversation, and thank to everyone that sticked around until the end.